For those of you joining us on the recorded session, welcome to Week 6, U.S. History Seminar Numero Dos. We're going to get underway here. All right, so this week in announcements land, the mid-quarter grades were stored Monday morning at 9 a.m. and I believe should have already gone home, or if you haven't gotten them, maybe today. It's a snapshot in time. Especially the first mid-quarter of any semester, we don't have a ton of points in the grade book. Things get more real as we go, but I would say if your grade is not maybe what you wanted it to be, now is the time to change your habits so that you can achieve a grade closer to what you want. I will say that I don't think there was anybody that had a failing grade that had turned in everything completed. I had one or two people that had submitted everything, but they had turned in stuff incomplete. So like the reading guide was incomplete and the first test was, they hadn't done the essay questions or whatever. And yeah, but for the most part, if you're failing, it's because you didn't turn in major stuff or a bunch of little stuff. So now's the time to change those habits so that you can start getting yourself out of that hole. There's nothing you can still turn in. As I have said in these sessions time and again, on the major work, the reading guides, the tests, you get 5 days after the due date to turn it in. After that, I don't take it. So if you've missed the grace period, then you need to turn in everything from this point on. Okay. So the first step in that is going to be you've got to get Unit 2 reading guide turned in. It is due tomorrow. That is the 5th. You have grace period through the 10th, but shoot for the 5th. As I have said numerous times and will continue to say, if you shoot for the 5th and you don't turn it in till the 6th or the 7th, you're okay. If you shoot for the 10th and you go to turn it in on the 11th, you're too late. There's nothing I can do at that point because I've already given you 5 additional days. That's what the grace period is. So get it done. If you haven't started it yet, you need to get on it. You should be almost done, if not done, with Unit 2 reading guide. Please check your submissions. So after you think you submitted, click on the assignment again. Make sure there is a green status bar that says submitted for grading. If it doesn't say that, if it says draft, not submitted, then there's an extra step you have to go through. If it says not submitted, then something went wrong. Okay? I can't grade things that aren't submitted. And I also can't grade things that are sitting in draft. I can only grade things that are fully submitted. So get her done. Chapter 24 audio is in the course. The first 2 sections of Chapter 25 are in. I apologize that I've been late getting this done. I've been trying to get through grading stuff for this class and stuff for the Montana Studies class, and the audios have just been low priority. But I will get those in first thing tomorrow for people finishing up the last 2 sections of Chapter 25. Actually ended up recording the Holocaust section twice because I had a phone call come in during my reading and it turned off my recording and I didn't notice it until I had already been through it once. So I ended up having to do it again. Next week is the Unit 2 test, which is worth 100 points. So make your plans now. Some of you on the Unit 1 test, this was mainly in the Montana class, but some of you it looks like you'd start it. So you'd hit start attempt, and then I don't know if you were called away or something happened or whatever, but you answered no questions and your timer went through. I had given you 2 hours on the Unit 1 test, and so it got to like 2 hours and 1 minute and it cut you off and you ended up with zeros. I did try to go through and catch those, and as I saw them I was deleting those attempts and letting people know so that they could start over. I will endeavor to do that again with Unit 2, but don't make that a necessity. If you hit start attempt, realize it's gonna keep your clock going. Don't tell somebody you're testing. Okay, tell your parents, hey, I'm taking a test. Please don't interrupt me. I will take out the garbage when I'm done. I will eat dinner when I'm done. Leave your phone outside the room. Just do it in one sitting. The people that are having issues with the timer elapsing are people who try to leave it and come back later. And 99 times out of 100, that just does not work anymore. It used to. It really did. I don't know why Moodle changed, but it no longer works. So please make your plans now to set aside a chunk of time to do your test. Okay. Remember that one of the essays will be based on something that we talked about in the live session either last week or this week. So if you didn't watch last week's live session, it is still posted. Go back and watch it. Well, hopefully if you're hearing me say this, you're watching this week's live session. I hope. Okay. Don't forget to do the week 6 discussion forum. That is something that a lot of folks that are failing, they have just either ignored the discussion forums, or they're doing one post. They're responding to the prompt, but they're not replying to other people's stuff, or maybe they're replying to one person's post, but they're not responding to the main prompt. They're not replying to two. Remember, you're supposed to respond to the main prompt, which means you need to use that create a new discussion button, and then reply to at least 2 posts from classmates. Getting the occasional message from somebody who's saying, well, it's giving me an invalid parameter error when I try to reply to other people's posts. They're saying typically it'll let them respond to the main prompt, it'll let them create a new discussion, but they can't reply to anybody else's post. Before contacting me about that, do me a favor and clear your browser cache. And also try it on a different web browser. That way we can start to narrow down, okay, where is the problem? Then if you've cleared the browser cache, C-A-C-H-E, by the way. If you've cleared the browser cache and you've cleared your browser data, and you've tried it on a different web browser and it's still, in all of those cases, it's still giving you invalid parameter, then is when you contact me. Please, before the forum closes. I mean, I'm getting messages Fridays at like 6:30, 7:30 at night. Folks, by that point, it's too late. I can't do anything. Please get on and get it done early. But what I can do when I get word that you're having this issue and you've tried these other things, I will log in as you and check and see if I can post. If I can reply, what that means is that it's not an issue with Moodle itself. Like, it's not a server issue. It's something with your either internet connection, Wi-Fi, or your computer. And then you can call the GFPS computer help desk and they can run you through some troubleshooting steps. But without that, then we don't know, okay, this is a server issue. Because if it's a server issue, there are things they can do with the data center to make that work. Okay. But I believe with everybody who's brought this to my attention, and we've tried posting as them, it's been an issue on their side of the system. So make sure you have multiple browsers. If you're on a Chromebook, not much you can do. Chromebook, so you can only use the Chrome browser. But if you're on a Windows machine and you're using Chrome, have Firefox downloaded. If you're on a Mac and you're using Safari, have Chrome and Firefox. Honestly, I have Chrome, Firefox, Safari, and Microsoft Edge all on my Mac. It just never hurts to have multiple browsers. That way you have a problem with one, try it on a different one. That way you can figure out, oh, it's a browser setting that's been, gotten weird. Or, no, I have something that's going on that's outside of my direct control. Okay, so please try those things before contacting me and before trying the help desk. Okay. Don't forget to do the seminar assignments, the Week 6 CNN 10 News Quiz, and the Week 6 Seminar Journal. Lots of folks that do not have the grade that they want, it's because they're just either ignoring those, or you're only doing the news quiz every week. You're totally skipping the journal. If you have to bug out before I give you the journal topic, that's why I post the video. That's why I post the seminar deck or the presentation deck document, so that you can get that journal topic so you can do the journal. Okay, so make sure to look at that, and that needs to be done by Monday morning at 8 a.m. And then last but not least, as I say every week, please join the Remind. Something that happened yesterday was that they took down Power School from 2:30 to about 4:30. I was able to send that out on the Remind. If you're not on the Remind, you missed that. And so if you tried to get on Power School during that time, you probably got an error. And that's because you didn't know. And that's because you weren't on the Remind. Any questions on any of that? Okay. So we're talking about World War II and the rights of man. Or human rights, if you want to call it that. Oh, and make sure if you have a question, or during the Montana session, there were apparently I froze a couple times. Please let me know that. Don't just put it in the chat. If possible, unmute yourself and say something to me so that I can basically restart the screen share. All right. So I think last week we touched on this a little bit, but I think that if you know anything about World War II, you are probably aware that the Axis countries were, to put it mildly, not great on human rights issues. Japan, last week we talked in fairly graphic detail, albeit quickly, about the rape of Nanjing and the takeover of Manchuria. This was very much par for the course for how Japan treated the areas that they occupied that were not Japanese. From China to the Philippines to Vietnam, all of those areas experienced a very brutal Japanese occupation. And the Japanese used in these areas torture, forced labor, germ warfare, and what became known as comfort women, which is basically sort of a forced rape type situation. What was that? Oh. So yeah, basically using women for using women's bodies, I should say, for comfort, basically abusing them sexually. Germany, and this doesn't even touch on Italy, and we talked about Italy and Ethiopia last week, but Germany obviously, they used brutal tactics as well. They deliberately attacked civilians in just about every place that they conquered. They were the German soldiers were told by Hitler to, quote, act brutally. And the Italians really were in the same vein as that. I will say the Italians were slightly less racially motivated than the Germans were. The Germans really had this notion of racial superiority that permeated everything. In the case of the Italians, it was only about permeated only about 90%, so slightly better. But it should also be pointed out that the Allied countries also abused human rights during the course of the war. In the case of the United States, the U.S. participated in attacks on civilian populations. This included the firebombing of Dresden. I have to leave soon because I have a doctor. Okay, again, folks, if you have to leave, just go and make sure you watch the video of whatever you missed. So, participated in attacks on civilian populations. This included firebombing major German cities, including Dresden, as well as herding Japanese Americans into internment camps, basically concentration camps that had a nicer name. In the case of the Soviet Union, all through the war effort, in order to try to even approach feeding itself, the Soviets were still collectivizing agriculture. They were also attacking civilian populations, and millions of Soviets died during the course of the war, millions of Soviet civilians. And then the British also deliberately targeted civilian populations. So none of these nations were paragons of virtue when it came to human rights. Obviously, the Nazis certainly are the most notorious abusers, and that is in the form of the Holocaust, the killing of 6 million Jewish people and at least 5 million members of other groups that were killed because they did not conform with Adolf Hitler's idea of racial supremacy. These folks were directly killed by firing squads and gas chambers and things like that. They were indirectly killed in forced labor camps by basically working them to death. So you can kind of see, I've just included a few images from this time. We could do 3, 4, 5, 10 classes on the Holocaust. We don't have that kind of time. I will say, if you ever get to Washington, D.C., a trip to the National Holocaust Museum is well worth half a day of your time. It does take half a day. Please do not go expecting you're going to be in and out in 20 minutes. It's a half a day tour, and probably some time afterwards to digest what you've seen. I, for one, have never gotten the chance to go and visit the concentration camps myself. I've been to Europe a couple of times, but I didn't have the time to go, and I was not close enough to those areas to go. But I hope to one day make that trip. But the Holocaust Museum is a really important thing if you ever get the opportunity to see it. If you would like to experience some decent representations of this from your own home, movies that you can watch include Schindler's List, which is an excellent film, and one that's a little more geared to younger audiences is called The Boy in the Striped Pajamas. Again, excellent film, not maybe quite so graphic as Schindler's List. Okay, so the Allies, the British, the French, well, kind of the French. The British, the Americans, the Soviets kind of get thrown in for the ride on this one, even though they were not so much fans of human rights. The Allies are going to make crusading for rights actually a decent part of this war, despite their own, frankly, abysmal records on these issues. This begins for the Allies with Franklin Roosevelt and a speech that he gives before America even joins the war. At this point, the United States is still we're now supplying the Allies with stuff, but the American people are still very isolationist. But in a speech given in January in front of Congress, January of 1941, Franklin Roosevelt lays out what, if America were to be fighting, what we would want to see, and what, honestly, we wanted to see as a result of this war. And it's called the Four Freedoms speech. If you've already done the forum this week or started the forum this week, you've heard this because this is what's linked in the forum. But in case you haven't, I am going to play it for you, just this snippet.
In the future days, which we seek to make secure, we look forward to a world founded upon four essential human freedoms. The first is freedom of speech and expression everywhere in the world. The second is freedom of every person to worship God in his own way everywhere in the world. The third is freedom from want, which translated into world terms means economic understandings which will secure to every nation a healthy, peacetime life for its inhabitants everywhere in the world. The fourth is freedom from fear, which translated into world terms means a worldwide reduction of armaments to such a point and in such a thorough fashion that no nation will be in a position to commit an act of physical aggression against any neighbor anywhere in the world. That is no vision of a distant millennium. It is a definite basis for a kind of world attainable in our own time and generation. That kind of world is the very antithesis of the so-called new order of tyranny which the dictators seek to create with the crash of a bomb.
Yeah, so freedom of speech and expression, freedom of religion, freedom from want, freedom from fear. These were the four freedoms that Roosevelt lays out as what he would like to see as a result of this war, how the Allies really differed from the Axis powers, that the Axis powers didn't believe in these things and the Allies really did. Ah, there we go. So how can the U.S. begin to help the Allies? Starting in 1939, the U.S. would begin helping the Allies through a policy called cash and carry. The U.S. had incredibly strict neutrality laws that prevented the selling of anything to any nation at war, period. In 1939, Roosevelt got Congress to agree that we could sell arms to belligerent nations, and really we meant Britain. with this. I don't know what would have happened if Japan had come to us with their checkbooks. We were having some trade issues with Japan at this point. We were about to cut them off from their oil supply. But we could sell arms to belligerents if they paid for them up front, so they had to pay cash, so they couldn't put it on a credit card, basically. Sometimes we'll sell things to countries, but in actuality, we pay for them and we allow them to pay us back. We weren't going to allow that to happen. They had to pay for it up front and transport them on their own ships, basically take them away themselves. So that was 1939, the cash and carry policy. This was okay, but by 1941, Britain was running out of money. Britain had spent a lot of their gold reserves buying U.S. weapons. Incidentally, they were getting U.S. weapons that were absolute crap. Like the U.S. agreed to give Britain some old destroyers that were totally antiquated. They were getting rifles from, World War I. The U.S. was not given its best stuff. So by 1941, the British were almost out of money. Like Churchill was considering giving Roosevelt the location of the British gold reserves in South Africa and just telling him to send a freighter and take it so that he could get enough weapons to keep fighting the war. And so in 1941, after Roosevelt wins his third term, okay, he had run for re-election saying basically he was not going to get us involved in the war. And after he won the third term, then he says, okay, we need to help Britain because if we don't, they're going to lose and then we're going to end up fighting. So Britain was basically saying, if you give us the weapons, if you give us the tools, we will finish this job. We will fight and defeat the Nazis, but we've got to have weapons because the British were being bombed every night. So their economic engine had almost come to a halt because all of their economic output was being bombed every night. So Roosevelt starts and gets Congress to agree to a policy called Lend-Lease that allows the United States to lend or lease military goods to Britain and actually, by this point, to the Soviet Union, who by now the Nazis had turned against the Soviet Union, and so now the British and the Soviets were allied. So this allowed the U.S. to supply Britain, the Soviet Union, and actually China to fight so that America did not have to fight. And we could lend or lease war supplies to any nation deemed, quote, vital to the national defense of the United States. And what this meant was if these countries lose, then we're going to have to fight, so let's not let them lose, basically. And incidentally, this was not universally popular. People like Charles Lindbergh, who was the first guy to fly over the Atlantic, people like Joseph P. Kennedy, who had been the ambassador to Britain and who is the father of future President John F. Kennedy, both speak out against Lend-Lease, both speak out against the U.S. becoming any more involved in this war. And in fact, both of them were in some ways supportive of the Nazis. They really thought the Nazis were going to win and that we should start talking to the Nazis and get on their good side. Okay, so late 1941, summer of 1941, Churchill, the British Prime Minister, and Franklin Roosevelt, the American president, will meet and they will sign a very important document for the rights of man known as the Atlantic Charter. This was a notable document because, number one, this was, again, before the U.S. entered the war. That Pearl Harbor had not happened. And Roosevelt basically said to Churchill, we can't join this war until there's some sort of provocative action so that the American public will support this. But what this did do was ally the two countries together in sort of a secret form. They agreed that neither Britain or the US would seek territorial gains out of this war. That was a huge change from World War I, where the US said we didn't want territorial gains, but Britain and the rest of the allies were like, gimme, 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 we want more land, we want more territory, we want to grow our empires. That's going to be a totally different situation with the Atlantic Charter. That changes to territory should only happen with the consent of the governed population. All people should choose the government under which they live, that there should be self-government for more peoples. Remember, this was called for after World War I, but that did not apply to the colonial possessions of countries like Britain and France and the United States. This did not put those qualifications on that. This document will help lead to the shrinking, we'll say that, of the British Empire. Because after World War II, countries like India and South Africa and Australia will, while still some of them being part of the British Empire, sort of, will technically gain their independence. Oh, also Canada. Free trade for all nations, reduction of trade barriers. They felt that this meant that if countries traded together, they weren't going to attack each other. That's actually held to be fairly true. And freedom of movement around the world, allowing people to travel between countries and experience different cultures. This also sets up the United States to aid the British in an undeclared naval war against the Germans in the Atlantic. The Germans were using U-boats or submarines to sink British and then American ships that were sailing from the United States to Britain with war goods. The American Navy is going to start joining the British Navy in helping them to neutralize those submarines and sink them, even though the Americans were not technically at war. The Atlantic Charter is followed the following year by the negotiation and signing of the Declaration of the United Nations. This ultimately was signed by 47 nations during the war. The first four were Britain, the United States, the Soviet Union, and China. This document promised to secure life, liberty, and independence and religious freedom for all peoples. So notice, fairly close with those four freedoms. The countries promised to join in a crusade to preserve human rights and justice in their own lands as well as in other lands. And only the 47 signatory nations were invited to take part in the UN conference that happened at the end of the war, the initial setting up of the United Nations that happened in San Francisco. And so again, this was a major document for the rights of man, and again, among the aims was that people should have the right to live under the government that they choose. Again, that's going to pretty much shrink the British Empire within the space of about 20 years. And these wartime crusades are going to lead to peacetime movements. This highlighted the hypocrisy of places like Britain saying that, okay, we want all people to be able to choose the governments under which they live. Well, what about your colonial possessions? And that will cause movements like that of Mohandas K. Gandhi or Mahatma Gandhi in India that will lead to those countries exiting the British Empire. That will lead to, in the United States, the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s, because African Americans will be encouraged to fight in this war. And one of the things that will come of this is something called the Double V campaign: victory against fascism, victory at home against racism. And these African American soldiers come back, and there is a certain part of the population that expects them to go from being, essentially equals fighting and dying for the country to now, okay, you need to go back to being second-class citizens. And these veterans go, no, we're not going to do that. Because what this highlighted was that no matter your skin color, everybody dies the same way. Everybody is impacted by bullets and bombs. It's not like the white people were more bulletproof than the black people or the Mexican people or any of those. Everybody can be hurt, everybody can die. So how do you argue that you're defending equal rights and fighting the racism of the Nazis when you practice racial segregation, is sort of the idea. And so this helps lead to the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s. Also, even before that, this will lead to the desegregation of the armed forces. President Truman will make that happen in the late 1940s. Much like the notion of allowing gay and lesbian soldiers to serve openly in the armed forces. At the time, they said that this would threaten unit discipline and cohesion. The unit got over it. So anyway, that's kind of to preview what's forthcoming with that. All right, so your journal topic, and this is kind of a thinker. So at least a couple of sentences. You should not answer this with, "'cause." Why do you think it is so easy for people to see the faults of other nations and to criticize their abuses of rights, and yet so hard to see their own shortcomings and to acknowledge the abuses of rights conducted by their own government? Okay? So that is your journal topic. I will leave that up if you need to copy that down or take a picture of it. It will also be in the presentation deck document that I will post here within about half an hour. Are there any questions about anything that we discussed today? All right, if there are no questions, I am going to allow you to be free. If you have something you need to discuss with me, hang out and we can talk about it.
Okay, see ya.
Have a good one.